Imagine a time when women visiting their doctors weren't treated for physical pain, but for hysteria, a so called medical condition blamed on everything from anxiety to sexual frustration. In those quiet, candlelit clinics of the 19th century, something surprising happened. Physicians began using mechanical devices, what we now call vibrators, to cure women. What started as a medical procedure would eventually become one of the most controversial and liberating inventions in human sexuality. In this episode, we'll peel back the layers of taboo and science to uncover the strange, fascinating journey of how a tool for doctors became a symbol of pleasure and empowerment. Let's go back for a moment long before the word vibrator was ever whispered in bedrooms or seen in glossy magazines. Picture the late 1800s, candlelight flickering across a doctor's office. A woman sitting stiffly in her corset describing her feelings of anxiety, restlessness, maybe sleepless nights, or sudden mood swings. The doctor listens, nods solemnly, and finally delivers a diagnosis that, by modern standards, sounds almost absurd: hysteria. This so called medical condition was once believed to affect countless women, blamed on an overactive uterus, and said to cause everything from fatigue to irritability to emotional instability. In truth, it was a label slapped on nearly any behavior that didn't fit neatly into society's narrow view of how women should feel or act. But here's where things take an unexpectedly intimate turn. The prescribed treatment for hysteria wasn't a pill or therapy or rest, it was what doctors called pelvic massage. The idea was that by manually stimulating the patient's genitals until she reached what they termed hysterical paroxysm, what we would recognize today as an orgasm. The excess tension would be released and her mood would stabilize. Yes, you heard that right. Physicians in their white coats and high collars were performing orgasms in the name of medicine. And for decades, this practice was considered a perfectly legitimate clinical procedure. Now, this is where psychology meets history in a way that's both fascinating and a little uncomfortable. At the time, the word sex was rarely uttered in polite company, let alone in medical journals. The idea of female pleasure was virtually non existent in scientific literature, which meant that these treatments were cloaked in medical jargon, stripped of any acknowledgement of desire. Doctors genuinely believed they were curing a disease, not facilitating pleasure. It was a strange collision of ignorance, repression, and anatomy. Imagine the emotional landscape for the women of that era, living in a world where they were taught to repress desire, yet feeling an undeniable biological pull toward pleasure. Many of these women probably didn't even have a word for what they were experiencing. Their bodies were responding naturally, but society and even science was too uncomfortable to name it for what it was. What we now understand as sexual tension or unmet desire was labeled as illness. It's almost tragic, but also deeply telling of how culture shapes what we think is normal. As medicine advanced, so did the challenge for doctors. The pelvic massage treatment, though considered therapeutic, was time consuming. Physicians began complaining, quite literally, that this method caused treatment fatigue. It was laborious and inefficient. And so, in the true spirit of invention, they sought a technological solution. Around the 1880s, the first electromechanical vibrator was born. It was large, heavy, and powered by steam or electricity, but it served a very specific purpose: to make the doctor's job easier. The device could bring on paroxysm in a fraction of the time it took by hand. Now, pause for a second and think about that. The vibrator, something we now associate with sexual freedom and self exploration, was originally a labor saving tool for overworked doctors. It's one of those historical ironies that perfectly captures how science can stumble into revolution by accident. Beneath the surface of this invention was something much deeper, a hidden shift in the psychology of desire. For centuries, women's sexuality was seen as secondary, passive, even dangerous if left unchecked. The notion that a woman could experience pleasure on her own terms was quietly radical. So, when the vibrator moved from clinics into private homes, first as a personal massager, advertised for relaxation or nervous tension, it carried with it the seeds of change. If you leaf through an early 20th century Sears catalog, you might actually find ads for these devices listed alongside hairbrushes and sewing machines. The language was innocent, a marvelous electric appliance for health and vitality, but anyone who used it likely knew there was more to the story. And as electricity became widespread, the vibrator became one of the very first domestic appliances to be electrified years before the vacuum cleaner or the iron. That fact alone says something profound about human priorities. What's fascinating here isn't just the invention itself, it's what it reveals about the psychology of repression. When society refuses to talk about something as fundamental as pleasure, that energy doesn't disappear, it just finds other outlets. In this case, it disguised itself as medicine, quietly weaving sexuality into the fabric of respectability. Every treatment, performed, every device sold under the banner of health was a silent rebellion against the cultural taboo surrounding women's desire. The body always finds a way to speak its truth, even when the mind denies it. This is one of the most powerful insights from the psychology of sex. Desire is not just about lust, it's about connection, validation, and self awareness. When those needs are suppressed, they surface in disguised forms: anxiety, tension, nervous energy. In a sense, hysteria wasn't a disease at all. It was the symptom of a society that refused to let women own their pleasure. The doctors, though perhaps well intentioned, became unwitting participants in a psychological drama much larger than themselves. Each session of therapy was a microcosm of repression and release, control and surrender, science and sexuality intertwined. The patient, encouraged to stay still and silent, experienced pleasure under the guise of treatment, her body communicating in the only way it could within the confines of the era's morality. But let's not mistake ignorance for malice. Many physicians of the time genuinely believed they were offering medical relief. In their world, the boundaries between physical health and emotional well-being were still poorly understood. Yet their actions tell us something timeless about human nature. When we suppress our sexuality, it doesn't disappear, it just hides in the language of legitimacy. When the vibrator entered the home, something extraordinary happened, though few talked about it openly. Women began to take control of their own pleasure, even if they didn't yet have the language to describe what that meant. Behind closed doors, they explored sensations that had long been deemed improper. What began as a prescription became a private act of self discovery. And whether consciously or not, this small shift helped to redefine what it meant to be a sexual being. It's no coincidence that decades later, during the sexual revolution of the 1960s and 70s, the vibrator reemerged, not as a medical tool, but as a symbol of liberation. Women who had grown up in silence now had the vocabulary to talk about desire, anatomy, and fulfillment. The same device that was once a doctor's instrument became a tool for autonomy, a bridge between body and mind. If you think about it from a psychological perspective, the vibrator's journey mirrors the evolution of our understanding of sex itself. At first, sex was treated as a function, something biological, mechanical, even pathological when misdirected. Then came the realization that it's also emotional, relational, deeply intertwined with our sense of identity. Today, we know it's a language, the body's way of expressing connection, curiosity, and creativity. When I teach about sexual psychology, I often remind people that our relationship with pleasure is really a reflection of how comfortable we are with ourselves. For much of history, society told women that their bodies existed for others, to bear children, to serve men, to remain modest. The vibrator disrupted that narrative, even if unintentionally, by offering pleasure without permission. It quietly told women, you don't need a diagnosis to feel good. You don't need validation to know your body. And yet, even today, echoes of that old stigma linger. Many still struggle to discuss sexual wellness without discomfort or judgment. But history shows that the more we bring these topics into the light, the healthier our relationship with intimacy becomes. When we normalize pleasure, we make room for honesty about what we want, what we fear, and how we connect. One of the most surprising truths about human sexuality is that it's not just about reproduction or gratification. It's about regulation. Orgasm triggers a cascade of neurochemicals: dopamine, oxytocin, endorphins that soothe the anxiety and strengthen emotional bonds. The doctors who thought they were curing hysteria were, in a roundabout way, harnessing these same biological processes. They just didn't have the science to understand what was really happening. Today, neuroscience paints a clearer picture. The sexual response cycle isn't merely physical, it's deeply tied to the brain's reward system. Pleasure reinforces behaviors that promote connection and well-being. When that system is suppressed or stigmatized, we see psychological fallout: stress, disconnection, shame. The vibrator story then isn't just about technology, it's about biology reclaiming its rightful place in our emotional lives. It's astonishing to think that an invention created out of convenience for male doctors became a catalyst for female empowerment. That's the beauty of history. It's rarely linear and often ironic. What began as a medical oddity evolved into a declaration of autonomy, reminding us that sexuality is neither a symptom nor a sickness, but a form of self-knowledge. Even now, the vibrator remains a cultural mirror. In some parts of the world, it's embraced as a tool of wellness and exploration. In others, it's hidden, whispered about, or banned outright. The same device that once sat proudly in a doctor's office is now sometimes treated as scandalous. It's proof that while technology evolves quickly, social acceptance takes much longer to catch up. Yet, the deeper message endures: our relationship with pleasure reflects our relationship with power. When people are taught to fear their own bodies, they become easier to control. When they learn to understand and honor them, they become free. The vibrator's medical origins remind us how easily control can masquerade as care, and how the most intimate revolutions often start in the quietest of places. So, The next time you hear the word vibrator, think beyond the stereotypes. Think of the women sitting in those 19th century offices diagnosed with hysteria for simply feeling. Think of the doctors unaware that their treatment was revealing a truth much larger than any diagnosis. Think of how far we've come from calling desire a disease to recognizing it as a vital part of being human. In the end, the vibrator story isn't just about sex, it's about science, psychology, and the enduring human need for connection. It's about how curiosity can outwit repression and how even the most unlikely inventions can lead us back to ourselves. It began as medicine, but became a mirror, a reflection of our evolving understanding of pleasure, autonomy, and what it means to truly feel alive. And perhaps that's the most fascinating part of all, that something born from silence and stigma became a voice for empowerment, a gentle hum that, in its own quiet way, changed the world. ChatGPT said there's something strangely poetic about how science, shame, and sexuality have always been intertwined. Throughout history, some of the most profound revolutions in how we understand desire didn't begin in bedrooms. They began in laboratories, lecture halls, and doctors' offices. The story of the vibrator is one of those rare intersections where science thought it was solving a medical problem, but what it really did was uncover a truth about human nature that society wasn't ready to face. It's a story that forces us to ask, how did something born out of repression become a symbol of liberation? To understand that, we have to return to a time when women's bodies were treated as medical mysteries. In the 19th century, the medical establishment believed that women were by nature fragile and emotional creatures ruled by their wombs. The word hysteria itself comes from the Greek hysteria, meaning uterus. Doctors believed that this organ could literally wander around a woman's body, causing nervousness, fainting, and all kinds of irrational behavior. And while that sounds absurd now, back then it was considered scientific fact. If a woman was anxious, irritable, or simply too outspoken, she was often labeled hysterical. The cure? Pelvic massage performed by physicians to induce what was called, in other words, hysterical paroxysm, an orgasm, yet no one would ever dare call it that. The pleasure it brought wasn't acknowledged. Instead, it was seen as a necessary discharge to restore balance to the body. The irony is that what these doctors called therapy was, in fact, the body doing what it was designed to do, releasing tension through pleasure. Now imagine being a woman during that time. You couldn't openly talk about desire or sexual frustration. The culture demanded modesty, obedience, and silence. So when a doctor prescribed this treatment, it may have been the only socially acceptable way for women to experience sexual release. This wasn't just about medical ignorance, it was about a society terrified of female sexuality. But as this practice became more common, something unexpected happened. The doctors started to complain. These treatments took too long, and frankly, they were exhausting. There are actual medical journals from that era where physicians describe hand fatigue and seek more efficient ways to induce paroxysm. And in that pursuit of convenience, technology came to the rescue. Around the 1880s, the first electromechanical vibrator was born. This was a pivotal moment, not just for medicine, but for psychology and culture. Here was a device that transformed what had been an intimate, hands on procedure into something mechanical, efficient, and strangely impersonal. What the doctors didn't realize was that this invention was about to cross a line they couldn't see, a line between control and freedom. At first, the vibrator was strictly medical equipment, but soon it began appearing in advertisements disguised under the language of health and beauty. They were marketed as nervous system stimulators or muscle relaxers. Early catalogs like Sears and Montgomery Ward even featured them as household appliances, right next to toasters and sewing machines. No one said what they were really for, but the suggestion was there, humming quietly between the lines. And so began the slow, secret migration of the vibrator from the clinic to the bedroom. Women, for the first time, had access to a device that could deliver pleasure without judgment, without diagnosis, and without needing permission. It was still sold under the guise of wellness, but privately, it offered something more profound, a sense of agency over one's own body. This was where science, shame, and sexuality truly collided. The vibrator was invented to suppress desire, to control it, to contain it within the language of medicine. But instead, it liberated it. It gave women a tool to explore themselves on their own terms. The same device that was meant to silence the body became the very thing that allowed it to speak. From a psychological standpoint, this shift was revolutionary. For centuries, female pleasure had been erased from the conversation about sex. Even the earliest scientific studies on human sexuality, written by men, focused almost entirely on male orgasm and performance. Women's desire was seen as secondary if it was acknowledged at all. The vibrator disrupted that narrative, not through protest or policy, but through quiet, private acts of self-discovery. Think about how radical that must have felt in a time when women couldn't even vote, when discussing sex was taboo, when pleasure itself was treated as pathology. The vibrator, in its unassuming way, became a symbol of rebellion. It told women that pleasure wasn't a problem to be cured, it was a part of who they were. From a psychological perspective, that realization is profound. Desire isn't just a biological impulse, it's an essential part of identity. It connects us to our bodies, our emotions, and our sense of agency. When desire is suppressed, we don't just lose pleasure, we lose a piece of ourselves. And that's exactly what centuries of sexual repression did to women. It disconnected them from their own bodies. The vibrator then was more than a machine. It was a psychological bridge reconnecting women to sensations and emotions they had been taught to ignore. And once that connection was made, it couldn't easily be undone. It's no coincidence that as conversations about sexuality became more open in the 20th century through figures like Kinsey Masters and Johnson, and later feminist thinkers, the vibrator reemerged as a tool of empowerment. By the 1960s and 70s, when the sexual revolution was in full swing, it had shed its medical disguise. What was once a doctor's instrument became a symbol of self love, independence, and equality. Feminist icons began to speak openly about it, not as a substitute for intimacy, but as a means of reclaiming pleasure from a culture that had long denied it. But beneath the cultural shift was a deeper psychological one. When people learn that their pleasure is valid, that it doesn't need to be justified or hidden, something changes inside them. Their relationship with their own body transforms. The shame that once controlled them loses its power. Pleasure becomes not just physical but emotional, a form of healing, a way of saying, this body is mine. Even today, the vibrator continues to evolve with technology. Modern versions come with Bluetooth, apps, and neuroscience based designs. But at its core, the message remains the same: pleasure and wellness are not opposites. They're intertwined. Studies now show that sexual pleasure reduces stress, strengthens immune function, and improves emotional resilience. What was once labeled as a symptom has turned out to be part of the cure. And that, I think, is the great irony of this story. Science set out to fix something it didn't understand. It treated desire as dysfunction and pleasure as pathology. But what it discovered instead was one of the most fundamental truths about human psychology: that sexuality is not something to control, but something to understand. Our bodies and brains are wired for pleasure for a reason. From an evolutionary standpoint, pleasure motivates behaviors that promote survival and connection. But from a psychological one, it does something even more important. It helps us feel alive. The same neurochemicals released during orgasm, dopamine, oxytocin, endorphins, are the very substances that regulate happiness, bonding, and emotional well-being. Pleasure, in essence, is nature's built-in therapy. So when those early doctors were treating hysteria, they weren't curing a disease. They were unknowingly tapping into the body's own healing mechanisms. Their misunderstanding reveals how often society confuses control with care. We've seen this pattern throughout history. Whenever something makes us uncomfortable, we try to regulate it instead of understanding it. And nowhere is that more evident than in our treatment of sexuality. The vibrator's journey from medical device to cultural icon shows how deeply that discomfort runs. For something so small, it carries an enormous weight of meaning. It's a reminder of how society once feared women's pleasure, how science once pathologized it, and how ultimately the body found a way to reclaim it. What fascinates me most as a sex researcher is how this story keeps repeating itself in different forms. We still see tension between science and sexuality today, whether it's debates over sexual education, the commercialization of desire, or the stigma surrounding sexual wellness products. Every generation seems to wrestle with the same question: how much of our sexuality are we willing to accept as natural? And perhaps that's the enduring lesson of this story. Shame and science don't have to be enemies, but when shame dictates science, we lose sight of the truth. The vibrator's evolution teaches us that understanding desire requires humility. It asks us to listen to the body, to the data, and to each other, because desire at its core is not something external to us. It's woven into the very fabric of who we are. So when we talk about the vibrator today, we're not just talking about a sex toy. We're talking about a symbol of progress, of resilience, of self-awareness. We're talking about the moment when technology accidentally gave women access to a part of themselves that history had tried to erase. We're talking about the intersection where science's pursuit of control met the body's demand for freedom and lost. If you think about it, that collision between shame, science, and sexuality still defines much of our modern discourse. We celebrate sexual freedom, yet we still struggle with guilt. We embrace innovation, yet fear intimacy. The story of the vibrator reminds us that real liberation isn't about technology, it's about permission. The permission to feel, to explore, to exist without apology. And maybe that's why this story still matters. It's not just about what the vibrator does, it's about what it represents. Courage to turn something once shrouded in secrecy into a conversation about empowerment, the realization that pleasure isn't frivolous, it's fundamental. And the understanding that science, when guided by empathy instead of embarrassment, can reveal the most intimate truths about what makes us human. So, in the end, this isn't just a story about an invention. It's about evolution, the evolution of our understanding of the body, the brain, and desire itself. It's a story about how the same forces that tried to silence pleasure ended up amplifying it. And perhaps most importantly, it's a reminder that every time science tries to tame sexuality, sexuality has a way of reminding science who's really in charge. Because no matter how clinical the setting, how repressed the culture, or how mechanical the tools, the truth remains the human body knows what it needs. And when we finally learn to listen to it, to honor its rhythms instead of fearing them, we discover something extraordinary. That pleasure isn't the opposite of science, it's the proof of it.